Well, hey everyone, welcome back. I'm so glad you're with us today. This is the last week, week 8 of Broken Signposts, Becoming a People Who Point to God. We've covered a lot of ground on a lot of topics in the last couple of months. We're just talking about things like love and spirituality, truth and beauty and justice. Today, we come to another topic, and one that on the surface would not seem like it points to God at all, but points away from Him. Today we're talking about power. And we live in a world that is rife with power abuses. I mean, my goodness, just you look at the news every day. All the scandals, all the lawsuits, all the harassments, the shootings. You think just about all the advertising and all the influencing that goes on. And it seems like power is being wielded always and forever to negative ends. And that's why we're really suspicious of power. Even though we'd like some of it, we're suspicious of anyone who has it. Because it's just so associated in our minds, and not wrongly, with force and coercion, manipulation, domination, violence. We don't like power. And that's why we have terms like power differential, like power grabs and power plays. We see these everywhere. We even have whole systems of thought that are informed by power. Namely, in our world, critical theory. Critical theory, which is, boy, if that's not a third rail topic for a lot of people. Critical theory looks at life through the lens of power. Who has the power, who doesn't, and what can we do to absolutely level the playing field, make all people and all perspectives equal? It's critical theory. It's all about power. But now let's get on the happy side of this matter, because at the same time where we see all sorts of power abuses, we also see great images like, the firefighter who might violently take an axe to a door, but he is trying to break in and rescue people from a fire. It's power. Or a surgeon laboring for hours over a body that's on the brink of death. It's using power. Or a teacher who faithfully goes into their classroom 5 days a week and brings knowledge to children. They're exercising power. And when we look at power in that way, we say, well, that's beautiful. That's a good thing. And I think those are examples actually of where power does point us to God. Because power is a gift from God. It's about 10 or 12 years ago that Andy Crouch, one of our great Christian public intellectuals, and also who happens to be a friend of Willowdale Chapel, Andy Crouch wrote a book called Playing God, Redeeming the Gift of Power. And he does indeed believe that power is a gift. In fact, he wants to use that word power, not its gentler euphemisms like agency or influence or leadership. Those are good, but he says, those are too soft and too benign. What we're really exercising is power. And power is a gift. It was not only demonstrated by God at creation, but it was given to His image bearers at creation. Power is bound up with our being created in God's image and being blessed and being told to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it. We're given power from God over this planet. It's almost as if God, planted and tended a garden called Eden and said, now, here's a great example of creative power used for flourishing. Why don't y'all run along and do that to the rest of the planet? It's power. It's a gift. But power can either be used well or misused terribly. Power can either create or it can destroy. It's just like power in your home. You have power into your home, electricity flowing into your home. It's a wonderful gift. I mean, it can keep your home warm and it can keep it well lit. It can keep your milk cold and your shower hot. But that same power can also spark and shock and electrocute and short circuit and start fires. It can create or it can destroy. And so today we want to look at power and how in Christ it can be used for all its life-giving, creative, flourishing ends. And how, if not, it'll go badly wrong like it already has in our world. Power is broken in our world. It's broken in us. Power is broken in me. Oh my goodness, I could not prepare this talk without becoming painfully aware again of all the ways in which I fall short in the use of the power that has been granted and delegated to me. I want to get better. But the good news is where power is broken in us and in our world, it is not broken in Jesus. And we're going to look at a story in the Bible where Jesus' power is really on full but poignant display. We're going to look at John chapter 19. This is Good Friday morning. Jesus is on trial. In fact, he's already stood before Caiaphas in the middle of the night, Caiaphas the high priest. Now he's been taken over to the Roman governor, to Pilate, early in the morning. Pilate's already interviewed him once, sees really no reason to, punish or crucify this guy. In fact, proposes back to the crowd like, hey, it's Passover time. We have this tradition, I release a prisoner to you. Why don't I just release Jesus back to you? And the crowd cries out, no, we don't want Jesus, we want Barabbas, the revolutionary, the insurrectionist. And that's where we pick up the story now in John 19, verse 1. Here's what happens next. Then Pilate took Jesus and flogged him. And the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head and arrayed him in a purple robe. They came up to him saying, Hail, King of the Jews, and struck him with their hands. Pilate went out again and said to them, See, I'm bringing him out to you that you may know that I find no guilt in him. So Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, Behold the man. When the chief priests and the officers saw him, they cried out, Crucify him! Crucify him! Pilate said to them, Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him. The Jews answered him, We have a law, and according to that law, he ought to die, because he made himself the Son of God. When Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid. He entered his headquarters again and said to Jesus, Where are you from? But Jesus gave him no answer. So Pilate said to him, You will not speak to me? Do you not know that I have power to release you and power to crucify you? Jesus answered him, You would have no power over me at all unless it were given you from above. Therefore, he who delivered me over to you has the greater sin. From then on, Pilate sought to release him. But the Jews cried out, If you release this man, you're no friend of Caesar. Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar. So when Pilate heard those words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the Stone Pavement, and in Aramaic, Gabbatha. Now it was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about the 6th hour. He said to the Jews, Behold your king. They cried out, Away with him! Away with him! Crucify him! Pilate said to them, Shall I crucify your king? The chief priests answered, We have no king but Caesar. So he delivered Jesus over to them to be crucified. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Now we have here in Pilate and Jesus a clear study in contrasts when it comes to power. One man has worldly power. The other man has not no power. The other man has all the power in the world. Pilate has a measure of worldly power. Jesus actually has all the power in the world. And how they use what they have could not be more different. So I want us to look at Jesus and Pilate in the light of power and see how power can be either misused or well used, and where that generation of power comes from. Let's start here. Pilate Pilate, we see here, I would say, is self-preoccupied. He's worried about himself, worried about his own agenda. Pilate is under a lot of stress here. I mean, probably just starts, we read in John 18 that they bring Jesus to Pilate's mansion, to his governor's house, early in the morning. It's like, great, this is how I'm going to start my day, dealing with some religious case that I really know nothing about. What makes matter worse is that this is not just any morning, it's the day of preparation before the Passover. Now, Passover was one of the great Jewish festivals of the year. It was called a pilgrim festival. People descended on Jerusalem by the thousands for a week-long celebration. And if you know your Exodus story, Passover was the catalyzing event for the Exodus, for the emancipation of God's people from slavery. So Passover is like Independence Day. And there would be rare times when it might be more ripe for insurrection and revolution than now in ancient Israel. Because the people would love to also now be emancipated from Roman rule, just as they were from Egyptian rule. And Pilate just has to keep the peace. He does not want anything going sideways, especially not now. And so he has a plan. He has an agenda. I can interview this Jesus. I can then, we'll release him. When he's not quickly released, when the people cry out, for greater punishment, give us Barabbas, not Jesus. Pilate, under all this stress, just has Jesus flogged. He just uses his power in the grossest, most ruthless way. Because twice Pilate says here, I find no guilt in him. He does not deserve even a beating, let alone a crucifixion. But Pilate gives him one anyway. Because he's stressed out, because he's self-preoccupied, because he just wants this thing to go away. And if somehow by beating him and showing that I'm at least giving some punishment, I can get this guy gone, well, then the ends will justify the means. And what we need to see right here, right straight away, is where we're coming from with power. Well, it starts in our hearts. It starts with recognizing that we have power and understanding the things that could make us abuse power. We have to recognize that power is within our power, even if we only have very little power by worldly standards. Viktor Frankl was a well-known psychiatrist back in the 20th century. He was a Holocaust survivor. He wrote Man's Search for Meaning, a famous book. And Frankl says this, between stimulus and response, there is a space. In the space, there is the power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. Or we could say our diminishment and our further enslavement. It's in our response. And Frankl is writing from the standpoint of a concentration camp prisoner. You might not have any real power there, but you can still choose your response. Pilate chooses his response. He's violent. He's ruthless. He has Jesus flogged because he's self-preoccupied. But Jesus is self-controlled, which is the height of the fruit of the Spirit, right? The fruit of the Spirit begins with love, joy, and peace, but it ends with faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. You could see self-control as the pinnacle of the Spirit-filled life, the Spirit-filled man. He is utterly self-possessed, self-controlled. And how do we know that's Jesus here? Well, because he lets happen to him what happens to him. He allows himself to be beaten and mocked. He allows a crown of thorns to be placed on his head, a mocking purple robe to be placed around his shoulders. He allows himself to be paraded out with people saying, "Behold the man." Now we know from the rest of the crucifixion story, Jesus himself said, I could call 12 legions of angels right now to get me out of this, to get me down off this cross. I could call 72,000 angels. That would be overwhelming force. That would do the job. But Jesus didn't, because he knew he had a different purpose. The Father had a higher will for him. Jesus had resolved this before, most notably in Gethsemane, the night before, when he prayed and he processed all his own anxieties and stresses with God, saying, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me. But not my will, thy will be done. And so Jesus accepts what is befalling him and stands there with Pilate saying, behold the man. Which Pilate probably just meant, well, here he is. But theologically, we see in the statement, behold the man, something horribly beautiful. Jesus is the image of God. Jesus is the true man, the exact representation of God's being. We're all created in God's image. We're designed to reflect God. Of course, we marred that image through our sin. But Jesus has no sin. He has all the fullness of God dwelling in him in bodily form. He is the man. But he's bloodied and beaten and marred and mocked because Jesus is becoming what we are, marred images of God, in order that we might become what he is, the true image of God. He simply bears all that is befalling him. He's not without power. He is choosing his response and using his power to save us. This just reminds me of an old story I read years ago, and I just have always liked it. It's from medieval times, from the Middle Ages, when life was a little more simple and primitive and where there were monasteries all over Europe. And a story is told about a band of murderers and thieves, an army that's conquering villages, and they're just pillaging wherever they go. And they reserve their harshest wrath for holy men, for clergy and monastics. They hate them most of all. Well, this army is approaching a village, and everybody has heard they're coming. So when the army arrives, the civic leader of the village reported to the commander, all the monks, hearing of your approach, fled to the mountains. The commander smiled a broad, cold smile, for he was proud of having a reputation for being a very fearsome person. But then the village leader added, all that is but one. The commander became enraged. He marched to the monastery and kicked in the gate. There in the courtyard stood the one remaining monastic. The commander glowered at the figure. Do you know who I am? The commander demanded. I am he who can run you through with a sword without batting an eye. And the monastic fixed the commander with a serene and patient look and said, and do you know who I am? I am the one who can let you run me through with a sword without batting an eye. And he has the true strength, the true power, especially because he has the hope of a resurrection, even if evil fully vents itself on him. He lives. The other eventually gets condemned. This is Jesus. Total control and self-mastery, using his power to stay put for us. But then the story continues. Pilate's trying to have Jesus released. He won't be. They won't accept him. In fact, they say, we have a law that says that anybody who makes himself out to be the Son of God deserves to die. And we read in verse 8 that when Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid. More anxious. Pilate is clearly filled with great anxiety at this. And why would it increase when they make mention of this Son of God? Well, the Romans had spiritual concepts and understandings, and one concept they had that they respected was the idea of the divine person, the person who had a special connection to the gods, the person who might in some respects represent the gods or have a certain union a certain power from them that the rest of us don't have. You don't want to fall afoul of the gods by running afoul of a divine person. Jesus is claiming to be the Son of God. What if he is? So Pilate brings Jesus back in and starts questioning him again, and specifically says, where are you from? You from heaven? You from Olympus? Are you from the gods? Pilate is extra nervous and anxious when they hear this title applied to Jesus. And anxiety is another way in which leadership and power can just go wrong for any of us. Pilate is highly anxious. Steve Cuss is an Australian part-time pastor, full-time leadership coach, who wrote a wonderful little book called Managing Leadership Anxiety. And he gave me an insight I had never had before, well, several, about anxiety. But one was that he said, in stressful situations, there are always those people who will shrink back because they're anxious and nervous and they don't know what to do. But he said, there are those who will step forward and kind of seize the reins and act like they know exactly what to do. They will power up in stressful situations. But he says, their motivation is the same. It's anxiety. It's anxiety that causes a person to power up and that causes them to shrink back. You just need to be aware that that is what's going on. You're reacting to a situation that's stressful because you're feeling anxious. Steve Cuss says, we often neglect the most powerful leadership tool, awareness of what is happening under the surface. All manner of triggers, reactivity, and stories bubble just under our conscious awareness. This boiling collective blocks our capacity to be present because it takes energy to manage, especially when we're unaware. And maybe Pilate has a vague awareness that he's in a very stressful, high anxiety situation here. But he doesn't know enough to examine that critically and respond rather than react. Jesus, on the other hand, he is aware, fully aware of exactly what is going on. He's aware of who he is, where he's from, where he's going. Pilate, in his anxiety, attempts to power up. Because Jesus won't answer his question. He's like, you're not going to answer me? Don't you know that I have power to release you or power to crucify you? He does, he reacts anxiously with powering up. Jesus, he's like, here's the truth of the matter. You would have no power over me at all unless it were given to you from above. And therefore, the one who delivered me over to you is the greater sinner. I mean, you say Caiaphas is more responsible for this than you are, Pilate, although you've got responsibility to bear here. But how interesting that Jesus is so aware that he is aware of his Father. He knows exactly what's going on in his situation, in Pilate's. He understands Caiaphas's culpability in this situation. Jesus is aware. And as we said already the night before in Gethsemane, he processed his anxiety, his stress, and he is now resigned to God in this situation. Aware and self-possessed. What, by the way, is making you anxious these days? I wonder, what's the biggest thing going on in your life right now? And how are you feeling about it? How are you responding to it? James Thurber, a great writer from days past, said, all people should strive to learn before they die what they're running from, and to, and why. And if we're aware of ourselves, our stresses, our triggers, our reactivity, we will be in much better position to use our power well rather than misuse it on others. Well, lastly, here's one other contrast between Pilate and Jesus. Pilate's fearful. He's particularly fearful when in verse 12 they say, if you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar. This probably had Pilate really shaken when they said this, because friend of Caesar was an honorific title given to certain sub-leaders in the empire who had a special relationship with Tiberius Caesar, the current Caesar emperor on the throne. But now, here's the interesting thing. There was a man by the name of Lucius Sejanus. He was the head of the Praetorian Guard, the personal bodyguard, the kind of elite force of Caesar. And Sejanus was Tiberius's friend. Until Sejanus was tried and executed for treason about the very time that Jesus was tried and executed as the Son of God. So in the background of this story, at least in Pilate's experience, is the fact that his status as friend of Caesar is very tenuous right now. If he missteps, he might get accused of treason. He might fall out of favor with the emperor and those who are loyal to him. And so there's great fear in Pilate at this point. And well, the die is cast now. Pilate will acquiesce to the wishes of the crowd. He will turn Jesus over to be crucified. What else can he do? You know, Steve Cuss says, anxiety is what you feel when you're not getting what you think you need. And Pilate so needs a way out of this. He so needs a peaceful solution to this. He so needs good public opinion because his poll numbers were already low. He was already in a tenuous circumstance, but he's not getting what he needs. And so he's just fearful and anxious. And well, what choice does he have but to save his own skin, to secure his own life? Pilate simply must survive. I mean, if this world is all you know, and this current life is the only one you have, it becomes ultimately precious to you. You have to save it. You have to secure it. You cannot die. But if, like Jesus, you know of another world, and you know of another life beyond this current one, well, then you're courageous and free. Jesus is courageous and free. He knows there's another world. He knows there's life beyond the grave. He knows he has resurrection power in himself. And so, by the way, I hope you know that too. You know, Colossians 3 reminds us that we're to set our minds on things above, not on earthly things, not on public opinion, not on acclaim, not on applause, not on how we're doing with any given person, not on people-pleasing, not on wealth and comforts or anything else. Set your minds on things above, not on earthly things, for you died. You died already to yourself and to sin, and your life is now hidden with Christ in God. And you know that when Christ, who is your life, appears, you also will appear with him in glory. Jesus knows his own future resurrection glory that's just 3 days away. And so he is courageous and free. And he can lay down his life as a ransom for many. He can continue to live into his mission, which was not to be served, but to serve. This is the calling upon us as well. I love what Dallas Willard wrote years ago. I've had this in my office on display for 10 or 15 years now. Here's some words from Dallas Willard. The first fruit of love is the musing of the mind upon God. You're setting your mind on things above. He who is in love, his thoughts are ever upon the object. Vision of God secures humility. Seeing God for who he is enables us to see ourselves for who we are. This makes us bold, for we see clearly what great good and evil are at issue. And we see that it is not up to us to accomplish it, but up to God, who is more than able. The result is assurance that the mission will be accomplished in God's time and in God's way, even if that entails death. We do the very best we know. We work hard and even self-sacrificially. but we do not carry the load, and our ego is not involved. In our love of Jesus, we have truly abandoned ourselves to Him. Our life is not an object of deep concern. Not this temporary earthly life anyway, not an object of deep concern. We can be courageous and free. We can give ourselves away for the saving of others, for the flourishing of others, for the good of the world, for the fulfillment of God's purposes in and through us. This is Jesus. This is what He does with His power. He allows Himself to be led away in death. It was all part of the plan. And in allowing this, Jesus both redefines and demonstrates true power. Power is self-sacrifice. Power is love. Andy Crouch in his book says this: power is not the opposite of servanthood. Rather, servanthood is the very purpose of power. Even in death, Jesus is not giving up power. He is restoring it to its original purpose, cleansed of its distortions, the power to love to the uttermost. It is holy power, utterly purified, without an ounce of self-protection or self-regard. Jesus simply never had a thought except to restore, redeem, and create a new community among whom power would be used always and only for flourishing. Friends, this is the great challenge to us in our power-fraught days, to live in Jesus mode, to use our power always and only for flourishing, the flourishing of others, not the protection or securing of ourselves. We take up our crosses daily and follow Jesus. The original followers of Jesus weren't called Christians, they were called followers of the way. The cross was the way. We get glory on the other side of self-sacrifice. It's the way. Philippians 2, and I'll close with this, puts it most poignantly. Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking the very nature of a servant, being born in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself, becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. And one of the greatest spiritual insights I've ever received in my life is the motivation for this move. It says Jesus, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God a thing to be grasped. But he becomes a human, servant, crucified. Now, I always thought that passage was saying, Jesus being in very nature God did something like the last thing you would ever expect God to do. He died for us. Now, humanly speaking, that's true. But what the message of this passage really is Jesus being in very nature God did exactly what God always and forever has done. Didn't claim all his rights and privileges for himself, but he took the nature of a servant and he laid down his life to save us all. That is the most God-like thing we could ever do. And whether in small ways or maybe someday in the ultimate sacrificial way, may he grant us the grace and the power to use our power for the flourishing of others. God be with you.
Thanks for checking out our online teaching. If you enjoyed this content and would like some more information about us, head over to our website at www.willowdalechapel.org or download our app. There you can stay up to date on any events, ministries, and other opportunities we have coming up at Willowdale Chapel.